On May 9, 1945, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of Adolf Hitler's 1,000-year Reich with an incredible request. He said, "The German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the hands of the victors. In this hour, I can only express the hope that the victors will treat them with generosity." Even more incredibly, the victorious Allies answered the Nazis' dozen years of unspeakable murder with a compliance to that request. Beyond all reasonable expectation, the despised peoples against whom the Hitler assassins had so brutally sinned rose to a shining hour of reason, justice, and civilization. The Nuremberg trials daunted humanity with its first and only chance to bring to judgment a crime so enormous, so shocking, so widespread, that its sheer scope threatened to overwhelm any hope of prosecution. And the special challenge was to do it not with victor's vengeance, but with the fairness and justice so scorned by the defendants. Autumn 1945, Nuremberg, Germany. The faint echo of goose steps hangs in air still heavy with the stench of the dead in the rubble. The Klieglit flags and massed stormtrooper banners are gone. The hoarse roar of cheering voices is stilled. The sea of ramrod arms raised in salute has evaporated. And in the wind is the howl of the dead for revenge. In the ruins of Berlin, much of the top Nazi leadership, fearing the rough and ready justice of the approaching Russians, would take refuge in death. Suicide has been the escape of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and the icy SS sadist Heinrich Himmler. But a few already dead monsters at the top would not be enough to satisfy what would be the judgment of the century.
There was a strong sentiment at the end of the war, when the Nazi depredations, the atrocities, were revealed, to carry out drumhead justice, to put the Nazis up against the wall, shoot them.
In the United States, the Secretary of Treasury, Morgenthau, felt that this was the right procedure. In fact, Morgenthau advocated that the entire Ruhr Valley be devastated and that Germany be reduced to a purely pastoral or agricultural state. Morgenthau was opposed in the United States by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. Stimson believed that the German war criminals should be dealt with only by trial before an international military tribunal. Stimson's view was that to punish these men after a trial would stand better in history. Moreover, that this process would develop a record of Nazi criminality which would stand in history. Stimson's views ultimately prevailed in the United States.
The laws of God and of man have been violated, and the guilty must not go unpunished.
On May 8, 1945, President Truman appointed Supreme Court Justice Robert H. Jackson as the United States Chief of Counsel, with the mission of bringing together the four major powers in developing an agreement for the trial of the major German war criminals.
He also said that this must be a real trial, not a show trial, not a Stalin trial, but a trial which could result in acquitting a defendant if the evidence did not show guilt.
There were hundreds of thousands of foot soldiers, let's say, of Nazism, who carried out the mass executions, operated the gas chambers, shot the hostages, and so on. But what about the top leaders? How did you convict them? None of them shot the bank guard, blew the safe, or drove the getaway car. Their hands were clean. There existed no international court. There existed at the time they were preparing for the trial no body of law. There existed no judges. There existed no courthouse. The instruments for trying a drunk driver in any part of the United States were more complete than the instruments for trying mass murderers in Europe at the end of World War II. So they started from scratch. A lawyer in the War Department by the name of Murray Bernays was given the task of devising some kind of philosophy for this trial. Bernays came up with a brilliant idea, which was the conspiracy theory, that the whole Nazi movement was just not simply a legitimate political movement, but it was a criminal conspiracy designed to seize the territory of Germany's neighbors, to steal from these nations their wealth and their people, and to exterminate their Jews. And this conspiracy theory meant that by being a part of the Nazi leadership, you were part of a criminal conspiracy, and it was a net that held these people.
It was agreed that three major types of crimes would be charged against these individuals. The first was the crime of waging aggressive war. The second was ordinary war crimes. And the third, crimes against humanity committed in the course of the war.
The indictment would reach unprecedented size with the declaration that the whole Nazi apparatus of repression and aggression would be indicted as criminal as well, including the Nazi Party leadership, the High Command, the Reich Cabinet, the Gestapo, the SS, with its hundreds of thousands of members, and the SA Brown Shirts, whose rolls numbered above 4.5 million. With harsh irony, the city of Nuremberg, the mystic home place of Nazism, was picked as the trial's location.
The courthouse was only a mile or so away from Nuremberg Stadium, where Hitler and Goering and Hess had screamed their defiance of other countries. So it seemed fitting that a lot of it started there, and then it should end there.
One of the few almost intact structures was the old Palace of Justice, an imposing building of great size, with a commodious cell block and fine security.
They took the adversary system of Anglo-Saxon justice used in England and in our country, which meant having a prosecutor contesting a defense counsel. Then they borrowed from the continental system the idea that judges will receive the evidence and make the determination rather than a jury. So you had a hybrid continental and Anglo-Saxon court. Everything new, never tried before. Well, one of the major questions is who's going to be brought to trial? And the British had a list, the French had a list, the Russians had a list, we had a list. At times that list may have been as long as 100 people. A compromise was reached and 22 prisoners were indicted. The majority of the defendants were provided by the American side. Why? Because we held most of them. We had them in our POW cages. The Russians were a little bit miffed at this.
From his opening statement and on throughout the proceedings, Justice Jackson's startling eloquence would burn the trial into history.
That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
The chief defendant stood accused of enough guilt to warrant 20 million murder trials. Even brought to bay, they exuded defiance. Hermann Wilhelm Goering, former Reich minister and number 2 to Hitler, would prove an unpleasant surprise for the prosecution. Confounding his image as a bloated, hedonistic clown, he would spring a steel-trap mind and intimidating personal force to boldly rally the accused in a fight for their lives. Rudolf Hess, third highest in the original Nazi power bloc, sporadically mined madness. But the Russians had special reasons to want his blood. The slave laborers in the V2 plants, run by Armaments Minister Albert Speer, died at the rate of 108 per day.
It is hard now to perceive in these miserable men as captives.
Jackson's scathing tongue labeled the accused mercilessly. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop was the salesman of deception. Party philosopher Alfred Rosenberg, Nazism's intellectual high priest. Walter Funk, the banker of gold teeth. Hitler youth leader Baldur von Schirach, the poisoner of youth. Fritz Sokol, cruelest slaver since the pharaohs. He might have gone on. Seyss Inquart, hangman of Holland. Frank, Jew butcher of Krakow. Streicher, merchant of hate. Frick, perverter of law. Bormann, Fritsch, von Neurath, Schacht, Dönitz, and Raeder, conspirators of international murder. It would be what England's Lord Burkitt would call a duel to the death between the representative of all that is worthwhile in civilization and the last surviving protagonist of all that is evil. With the bitter emotions of the Nuremberg trial about to break loose, a nervous occupation army built up security.
There were fears at a couple of occasions that there might be remnants of the SS that would organize and try to take the prison. At various points in the trial, tanks would be surrounding the courthouse. There would be riflemen on the rooftops because they didn't know what the attitude of the German people were going to be. And the interesting thing is that the attitude was one of almost total indifference. The German people at this point were shattered. Their cities lay in ruins. They were looking for a bar of soap, something to eat, a crust of bread. They couldn't have cared less what was going on in that courthouse in Nuremberg.
An American colonel, Burton Andrus, a humorless Nazi-hating disciplinarian, took charge of the prisoners. He happily put the corpulent Goering on a strict diet that shrunk 80 pounds off his 5'6" frame. After the suicides by hanging of second-rank prisoners Robert Lee and Leonardo Conti, guards glared steadily into the lighted cells through watch ports day and night. Chairs were not permitted within 4 feet of walls, and prisoners' hands had to be in view at all times. Talking to guards and any exchange of military courtesies were prohibited. Some prisoners reported Andrus appearing in their nightmares. There were 4 prosecution teams at Nuremberg, reflecting the 4 major powers running the trials. Heading the prosecution along with Robert Jackson were a crack British team led by Sir Hartley Shawcross, British Attorney General, and his deputy, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. France sent Champetier de Ribe, former French Undersecretary of State, and Russia Lieutenant General Roman Rudenko, Chief Prosecutor of the Ukrainian Republic.
Justice Jackson was not only the leader of the American prosecution staff, he was really the inspiration for this entire trial.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
Jackson had worried about a dearth of evidence. He hadn't counted on the German character. Evidence arrived in mountains.
One of the things that we associate with the German character is an orderliness, a fastidiousness about record keeping particularly, The thump of the rubber stamp on a document is a very Teutonic sound. During the course of the Nazi regime, this quality of character persisted. And virtually everything that these people did was documented.
47 crates of binders, 3,000 pounds of Nazi Party records, tons of diplomatic papers, 12 volumes of secret foreign policy conference records, and miles of film poured in. Jackson decided to switch his prosecution away from witnesses.
As things went along and we uncovered all these interesting documents which were so incriminating of the defendants, Justice Jackson made the statement that perhaps it could be mainly a documentation trial.
Dead set against this was the colorful General William Donovan. He was head of the Cloak and Dagger OSS and a hugely decorated hero of 2 wars who had gathered much of the evidence.
General Donovan felt the trial would not have a real impact unless there were live witnesses on the stand being interrogated, telling it like it was. He thought that was the way to capture public attention.
Jackson would have his way, and the violently opposed Donovan would quit the trial, taking much needed talent and expertise with him. Germans were free to choose any lawyer they wanted, and they did, including unregenerate Nazis who might have belonged in the dock themselves.
The defendants had, in effect, a gilt-edged defense. Any poor defendant in an American court today would be lucky to have the quality of defense, because some of these people were top lawyers in Germany. Some of them went on to fabulous careers in the years following the war.
The primary defense of the German lawyers at Nuremberg on the question of aggressive war was that the charge was ex post facto. They argued that never before had any head of state been called upon to answer the crime of waging aggressive war, and that there was no juridical basis for this charge.
Sir Hartley Shawcross replied, "I suppose the first person ever charged with murder might have said, 'Now see here, you can't do that. Murder hasn't been made a crime yet.' The tribunal said, 'The very idea that states commit crimes is a fiction. Crimes are always committed by persons. Men who exercised great power cannot be allowed to shift their responsibility on the fictional state which cannot be produced for trial.'"
Nein, ich kenne mich keinesfalls schuldig.
Now the accused filled the court with their firm cries.
Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig.
Not guilty. Hermann Goering was the leader of a group of defiant defendants.
At Nuremberg, his philosophy was, these people are not going to exonerate us. This is victor's vengeance. They won, so we're in the dock, and we can go belly crawling, which I'm not about to do, or we can hold our standard high and we can go down with the swastika flying. He took that attitude, and his carryover influence from his position in the Third Reich was still effective over many of these defendants. He was able to dominate them, to frighten them, to intimidate them, and had a good deal of leadership throughout the trial.
There was a problem big enough to swamp the trial. How to make the words of the court and defendants comprehensible to one another and to the world.
An American judge and an English judge speaking, of course, English, a Soviet judge speaking Russian, and a French judge speaking French. 3 languages there. The defendants were German. They had to be questioned in German, in their own tongue. So IBM had an idea. IBM suggested some equipment that they were working on which would provide something that we take completely for granted today, instantaneous translation. And one of the most successful recruiting grounds for interpreters were international telephone exchanges. These people were used to working very quickly with language and had very practical knowledge.
The most difficult and noble task of the prosecution was not to center the case upon the most lurid of the German atrocities and go for the patient, brilliant assembly of an airtight case built on the conspiracy. the greater goal was to convict the whole machinery of aggressive war on behalf of the humanity it had ravaged.
In January 5, 1937, in a secret meeting with his top political and military leaders, Hitler had announced that it was his intention to solve the German space problem, that this could only be solved by force, and that the only question was when and how. And from that secret meeting on, Hitler continued to plot his eventual assault upon Europe.
Again and again, the eyewitnesses and documents brought Hitler's own damning words. It is my unalterable decision to squash Czechoslovakia by military action in the near future. It is the job of the political leaders to bring about the militarily and politically suitable moment. The world now looked in on a chilling series of top meetings with Hitler, von Papen, Goering, Frick, Keitel, Jodl, von Ribbentrop, and the rest. Where the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria were subjected to secret, merciless threats of military annihilation to make their fall to the Germans seem a desire from within. The prosecution traced back the carefully forged chain of criminal moves, the trumped-up evidence of the Reichstag fire to create crisis, the orchestration against perceived enemies of the Reich, trade unions, the churches. Beginning with the Nuremberg laws of 1935, Jackson dug into the campaign against the Jews, the legislation destroying their property and civil rights, their systematic exclusion from professional, cultural life and education, ending with vandalism, violence, and imprisonment on the way to calculated war and murder. Goering had summed it up. He said, "I would hate to be a Jew in Germany today." Continuing to weave the net of a conspiracy against peace at the expense of the more sensational and easily grasped atrocities, Prosecutor Robert Jackson pressed doggedly through the aggressive war charges. One by one, he documented the incriminating secret maneuvers of Adolf Hitler, each aimed at naked aggression and provable by a trail of evidence. Documents under Hitler's signature read, "No question of sparing Poland. We are left with the decision to attack Poland at the first suitable opportunity." He would say, "I am only afraid that at the last moment some Schweinhund will make a proposal for mediation." The details that emerged were dry but unmistakable. How the men in the dock had cynically, murderously pushed an entire world toward devastation. The evidence showed that military destruction had not been enough for the Nazis. Plans in place set in motion a systematic annihilation of intelligentsia, nobility, and clergy. The Jews and Gypsies would have their own hideous attention, losing 6,000,000 and 500,000 lives, respectively. Directives were found that invited the lynching of Allied airmen without interference from the police. Other decrees ordered Labor Czar Fritz Sokol to deliver 5 million captive workers into slavery that was often a death sentence. A Nacht und Nebel, or night and fog order, had the promotion of pure terror at its roots. People disappeared forever without charge or trial. The conspiracy spiraled with attacks on Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, France, Greece, Yugoslavia, and Russia. Jackson pointed out that Germany never declared war under international rules, but struck always without warning and always against the signed assurances of treaties. Goering would later boast that the Nazis had considered your treaties just so much toilet paper. All this conspiratorial horror, wrung from dry paper, would come to light separately from the graphically presented terrors of the genocidal death camps. The prosecution would show a film called The Nazi Plan, based on early German propaganda films and meant to demonstrate that they had planned aggression from the first. Its effect on the defendants was electric and jocular. Chirac thrilled to his marching Hitler Youth. Goering gleefully shouted the name of each plane and pilot he recognized. He whispered, "Even Justice Jackson will want to join the party now." Schacht, watching his war production glorified, asked, "Can you see anything wrong with that?" And awed, von Ribbentrop breathed, "Couldn't you just feel the force of the Führer's personality?" The mood of the defendants changed sharply when the film turned to the cruel and humiliating kangaroo court trial of those accused in the bomb plot against Hitler. As the Nazi prosecutor screeched abuse, the accused at Nuremberg soberly contrasted the vicious justice of the Third Reich with the even-handed tone of their own trial. Jackson, the brilliant rhetorician, was less skilled in the courtroom arts of cross-examination. His shortcomings were often shared by lesser prosecutors who became tangled in droning details. World interest waned.
The fear of Justice Jackson was that the moral authority would just leak out of this trial as it dragged on and on and on. In the end, it lasted 11 months. He attempted to try to stifle the amount of just sheer paper that the German defense could introduce.
Jackson began to see the International Military Tribunal as foes arrayed against him. Especially vexing were his fellow American Francis Biddle and the Englishman, Sir Geoffrey Lawrence.
Lawrence wanted to rob the defendants of any capacity to claim that they weren't given a complete defense. Goering has just testified on his own behalf, and then he's being cross-examined by Justice Jackson. This is a dramatic high point, and everyone is waiting to see how the champion of justice and democracy deals with the champion of Nazi evil.
I want to get what's necessary to run the kind of a system that you set up in Germany.
Goering has a leg up in this thing because Justice Lawrence keeps ruling that Goering must be allowed to say as much as he wants to say. The usual rules of cross-examination are that the prosecutor is able to crowd the witness, to keep pushing him with relentless questions towards a trap and then spring the trap. But when Goering could virtually deliver lectures on the political science of Nazi Germany, Jackson was never able to crowd him like that.
Goering's 2.5-day diatribe turned the court into a Nazi rally and made him the defendant's hero, like an athlete who had saved the game. Had Jackson made a mistake in not going directly after the most hideous and hateful of the crimes and criminals? Would his great hope for convictions on a cosmic scale allow the main case against war to slip away into its own night and fog? Between the enormous scope of Robert Jackson's indictment, American technical miscues in prosecution, and the surprising fairness of the proceedings, the Nuremberg defendants began to believe that they might yet prevail. But now the tide turned with the shocking testimony of the Nazi butchers who had run the concentration camps and extermination squads. Their testimony jolted the world back to attention. Almost offhandedly, Gestapo officer Otto Ohlendorf made his admissions.
How many men, women, and children did you kill during that year? And he answered, 90,000. With that information, we were able to develop that contemporaneously with the German assault against Russia, 4 special action groups of the Gestapo and SD were sent into the occupied territories behind the German armies with the specific purpose of rounding up and killing all Jews and gypsies, intelligentsia that they could get their hands on. The estimate is that 2 million people were killed by these special action groups.
Ferdinand Höss was the commandant of Auschwitz. Höss explained his mission in great detail and without any great emotion.
He had been called to Berlin by Heinrich Himmler, and Himmler had explained to him that there was a secondary war involving the struggle between the Germans and the Jews, that if Germany did not deal with the Jews at this time, the Jews would certainly destroy Germany. And it was Höss's mission to establish at Auschwitz an extermination center. It is the most devastating confession of murder by any individual in the history of mankind.
The prosecution introduced a film called Nazi Concentration Camps, a compilation of death camp horrors which was assembled by America's noted film director, George Stevens. Many of these scenes were being shown to the world for the first time and produced unimaginable revulsion. Weeping broke out in the courtroom. Women fainted. And time after time, the words of the leaders and followers who had caused it all arose from written records to condemn them. Himmler had summed up the ethic. I did not feel justified in exterminating the men while allowing their children to grow up to avenge themselves. General Jodl said, if we had disobeyed, we would have been arrested, and rightly so. Höss quoted his boss Adolf Eichmann as saying, he would leap laughing into the grave because the feeling that he had 5 million people on his conscience would be a source of extraordinary satisfaction. The prosecution now began systematically to demolish the wall of just following orders that the High Command had tried to build around itself. Prosecutor Telford Taylor would say that men who commit crimes cannot plead as a defense that they committed them in uniform, and that military men are not a race apart, men above and beyond the moral and legal requirements that apply to others incapable of exercising moral judgment on their own. It was pointed out to Keitel and Jodl that when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had received the supposedly inviolable order to execute all commandos as captured, he had promptly and contemptuously burned it. Hard-fighting Nazis like Admiral Karl Dönitz would have their victories. In what was known as the Laconia Order, he had directed that survivors of sinkings not be helped in any way by his U-boats.
He had a very shrewd lawyer, a German naval lawyer by the name of Otto Kranzbühler. Kranzbühler managed to get an affidavit from Admiral Chester Nimitz, a hero of America in the Pacific War, to the effect that the Americans had fought no differently, that in the Pacific we had sunk what was there that we presumed to be an enemy vessel, made no attempt to try to rescue Japanese sailors off of an aircraft carrier that was going down.
The tactic would save Dönitz's life. The other allies were startled at how vehemently the Russians demanded the death penalty for the now half-mad Hess.
What was Rudolf Hess doing in that dock? During the war, when people were being exterminated en masse in the concentration camps, when hostages were being done away with in batches of 1,000 at a time, Rudolf Hess was sitting in a cell in England as a result of a chaotic peace flight that he had made in 1941.
It was Stalin's rage, pure and simple. He correctly saw the flight by Hess to England as an unforgivable attempt to arrange a separate peace with the English and thus isolate Russia against the German onslaught. An IQ test of the defendants showed the top leadership of the Third Reich averaged a university level 128, ranging from Schacht's high of 143 down to Streicher's dull normal 107. But there was nothing tepid in the intellect of Albert Speer. As German Minister of Armaments, he had wrought wonders of production for Adolf Hitler. He had wept openly at his Führer's death, but emotion was no great part of him. The fierce death rate among the 400,000 forced laborers he had demanded from Fritz Sauckel, the conscript labor czar, had not turned a hair on Speer's handsome patrician head. But it had put him in mortal danger, and he sought a way to live.
Speer was an engineer and an architect who knew how to think through a problem in a very analytical way. And he very clearly had thought through what would work best at Nuremberg, and he read that court very well. They didn't want any more excuses. They didn't want any alibis. They wanted to hear a Nazi get up and say, "We're sorry. We did terrible things to mankind. We left a terrible stain." And this, in effect, was the attitude that Speer took in his own defense.
To keep the dead slave laborers from putting a noose around his neck, Albert Speer would have to use all the charm and intellect that had endeared him to Adolf Hitler. After long months, the prosecution had invoked the smoke of burning villages, the stench of prison cars, and the groans of the tortured and starved from the dry documents and testimony. They had traced it all back to a conspiracy of corrupt and vicious leaders. The tribunal retired to weigh judgment. In stark coincidence, on the day the prosecution concluded its case, Winston Churchill made his bombshell Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, effectively launching the Cold War.
Descended across the continent.
Well, this is what the Nazi defendants had figured would happen all along, that at some point the West would wake up to the fact that the Germans were not their real enemies, that the communists were their real enemies. And when Churchill made that speech, that seemed to confirm all of their convictions, and they really thought that at this point they could not be convicted, they would not be condemned, they would not be executed.
Hess whispered to Goering, "You will yet be Führer of Germany."
The whole process took perhaps about a month, during which, when the judges were in their chambers, they were going over the guilt or innocence of these people. And they did a very conscientious job.
On October 1st, 1946, after 315 days of trial, the sentences were pronounced.
Hermann Wilhelm Goering, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Joachim von Ribbentrop, death by hanging. Fritz Sauckel, death by hanging. Julius Streicher, death by hanging. Wilhelm Frick, death by hanging. Hans Frank, death by hanging. Alfred Rosenberg, death by hanging. Wilhelm Keitel, death by hanging. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, death by hanging.
Also sentenced to death were Jodl, Seyss Inquart, and Martin Bormann, who was tried in absentia. Hess, Funk, and Raeder got life prison terms. Speer, von Schirach, von Neurath, and Dönitz got long sentences. Fritsch, von Papen, and Schacht went free. All indicted organizations except the SA were convicted, as were the General Staff and High Command and the Reich Cabinet.
Interestingly, the defendants at the end of the trial, while they railed at the jurisdiction of the court, that the court had no right to try them, most of them were very grateful and expressed their gratitude for the defense they had received, and the latitude of defense that their counsels were granted.
The defendants' reactions ranged from cringing to venomous. Fritsch muttered that he was drowning in filth. Frank said, 1,000 years will pass and Germany's guilt will not have been erased. But Goering thought that 50 years from now there will be statues of me all over Germany.
In the end, Sauckel, the slave trader, received a sentence of death and was hanged. And the slave master, Albert Speer, got a 20-year sentence. Sauckel was merely doing his bidding, providing the bodies that Speer needed. Sauckel was a crude, vulgar, lower-class German, not very well educated. Speer was a cultivated German, spoke very good English, very charming manner, and I think very clearly that this played a role in the fact that Sauckel was hanged and spirited 20 years and went on to write some very successful books about his experiences in the Nazi regime.
With all appeals refused, executions were set for the night of October 16, 1946. The prison was locked down. The only information allowed in was the inning-by-inning score of the American World Series. The executioner, Army Master Sergeant John Wood, who had hanged 347 men in 15 years, directed his 5-man team in setting up 3 portable gallows in the prison gym.
About 11 o'clock at night, the electrifying word came that Hermann Goering had committed suicide at the 11th hour, thereby cheating the hangman.
Goering had obtained a cyanide cartridge from his luggage, possibly with the unwitting help of a young American lieutenant he had charmed. He died in blue silk pajamas, leaving notes absolving his jailers of complicity. A Russian general slapped the dead Goering's face. Colonel Andrus raged. Nurembergers delighted in the victory of our Hermann.
Joachim von Ribbentrop walked through the door into the execution chamber. He walked to the foot of the 13 stairs leading to the gallows platform. He saw the hangman there with the noose of 13 coils and the hangman's assistant with the black hood.
The hangings were botched. Necks did not break as intended. Von Ribbentrop took 17 minutes to die. Jodl, 18. Keitel, 28. Sergeant Woods would never hang anyone again. Streicher died screaming, "Heil Hitler!" Keitel said, "Now is the time to join my sons." Speer, von Schirach, and Hess was sent to mop up the blood. Hess paid homage to the carnage with a Nazi salute.
Early in the morning, 2 trucks carried these caskets to Munich, where the bodies were cremated. It is said that in the evening of that day, the urns of the 11 men were carried to the river Isar, and the ashes cast into the river, carried down the stream to the Danube, and thence to the sea. Thus ended the Hitler tyranny.
Although his absence from Washington had cost Robert Jackson his dream of becoming Chief Justice of the United States, he called his time at Nuremberg the most important and enduring work of my life. Rudolf Hess, at 93, the last inmate of Spandau prison, would end his life after 42 years of confinement by hanging himself. Von Neurath, Dönitz, and others would serve their terms and return to modest, even respected lives in the Germany they had dishonored. Woods, the hangman, was electrocuted in an accident while serving in Korea. The jailer, Andrus, died at 85 shouting frantically, "Goering has just committed suicide."
Nuremberg stands firmly against the resignation of man to the inhumanity of man. This brings us to the point that the most important thing that was achieved at Nuremberg was not the conviction of these men and not the sentences imposed, but the determination for history that waging aggressive war is a crime.
Since 1945, no avowed Nazi has held significant public office in Germany. From then to 1992, there have been 24 wars between nations and 93 wars of insurgency that killed some 16 million people, many by genocidal methods. More and more, The world must turn its hopes to the legacy of the trials at Nuremberg and examine the sturdy instruments of justice forged there for new and inspired use in a world where justice is still too rare.